Howard joined the Liberal Party when it was what he called a broad church. Then when he was in power, he systematically removed everything left of the nave and turned it into a conservative party in which a rich, white hedge fund manager who happens to occasionally think about the environment has difficulty finding a pew. And I'll say this, I will say this unequivocally, in fact. If you advocate for the busting of unions, I advocate for the busting of your skull. The same can be said for corrupt union officials, of course. You can't have it either side. You're both absolutely scum. You read the title correctly, squad. Today is finally the day I found the time. I've made over 25 videos for this history playlist all up, and I think I've mentioned the former Australian Prime Minister John Winston Howard about 47 times collectively across the bulk of those videos. Love him or hate him, and to be honest, I think only his mother could really love him. Love him or hate him, he was the second longest serving Prime Minister in the country of Australia's history, and he had a significant impact on the nation of Australia. For better or worse, if you're Australian, this man has affected your life in some capacity. This video will attempt to detail the majority of the worst aspects of his so-called leadership, but just briefly before the intro to give his fans a little bit of something to go off, I do want to mention that he was the Prime Minister of Australia who passed sweeping gun control legislation in 1996. An inanimate carbon rod could and would have passed gun control legislation in Australia after the Port Arthur massacre in 96. Howard was not risking anything politically. It was something the vast majority of the country wanted and supported. With the exception of some fucking hicks in far north Queensland, most Australians wanted the ability to buy guns to be removed for head cases like Martin Bryant. I could make a whole video with my thoughts about gun control, and I guess I will if enough of you want me to, but the crux of my point is that Howard was not prepared to be a political martyr for the sake of common sense legislation in 1996, as some people seem to suggest he was when discussing the potential for American gun control. If the majority of the Australian population didn't support gun control in 1996, John Howard would not have passed it. But personal motivation be damned, it was a bloody good thing. It was a bloody good thing that he did it. I guess what I'm saying is a broken clock is right at least twice a day or something like that, right? Gun control was a good thing that came from the Howard government. Everything else the little worm did was bloody horrid though. And we're focusing on those everything else parts for this video. These guys are the financial supporters of the channel. Click the links in the description if you want to give me some of your money like they give me some of their money each month. Or, you know, don't. Watching my videos and sitting through the unskippable ads helps me enough as well. I'll see you after the jingle so we can get into it. Well, where do we start? When you look back at the last 30-odd years of Australian history, you see that virtually every trouble afflicting Australia today had its genesis in one or another of the Howard government's policies. Maybe aside from the bushfires last year, but then again, wait, actually, even then with last year's bushfires, an argument could probably be made that it was Howard's government's inaction when it comes to backburning and a lack of hazard reduction burns, which led to a build-up of fuel over the years for the wildfires that ended up being the worst in our history last year. But one can't really blame him for 30 years of ineptitude on both sides of politics if they're being fair, as much as one would like to, so we'll give him a pass on the bushfires. I guess we could have started this video with an analysis of the bushfires, but I think it's probably best if we start near the beginning of the millennium. We start with one of the worst government decisions made in Australia since the Vietnam War, in fact. The decision to commit Australian forces to the Second Iraq War, or the Second Gulf War, or whichever you would want to call it, the war that started in 2002 with Iraq, right? Unless you've been living under a rock, you're probably undoubtedly already aware that America invaded Iraq back then under the guise of there being weapons of mass destruction hidden within the depths of the Middle Eastern nation, right? In a nutshell, Howard presented that argument at the time to Australians, just like President Bush did to his people here in America. And we all know that to be folly now. So I won't go too hard down that rabbit hole because it's just stuff you've all heard before. But at the end of the day, putting it as bluntly as I can, Howard committed Australian forces to the second war in Iraq because he wanted to be seen to be of use to the Americans. That decision cost a lot of blood on both sides of the war, and money, mostly on the side of the Allies, right? It also sucked Australia into the vortex of terrorism. Prior to the September 11th attacks, and that's the September 11th in 2001, prior to the September 11th attacks and Australia's subsequent declaration of support for America, Australia had not been the target of terrorism by radical Muslims for at the very least over 2 decades, but ever, really, if you want to get technical. There was an attack on the Turkish consulate in Australia in 1980 that I guess you could technically classify as a terrorist attack by a radical Muslim, because that dude was a radical Muslim, and the attack was a terrorist attack on Australian soil, but it had nothing to do with Australia or Australians. He was a Turkish national, and it was about Turkish political stuff. I'll give a link to the details. I'll leave a link that details the 1980s attack in the description. But anyway, we basically weren't the targets of radical extremist Muslims until we openly declared support for America after the September 11th attacks. Since 2002, there have been 15 or more politically motivated terrorist attacks by extremist Muslims on Australian soil, with countless others prevented by ASIO before they could be carried out. ASIO is Australia's version of the CIA, by the way, Australian Secret Intelligence Office or something like that. Now, I'm not saying that Howard should have sided with Al-Qaeda, and I'm not blaming him for crazy extremist dickheads being crazy extremist dickheads, right, by any stretch of the imagination. However, we do all know that the Second Gulf War was bogus now, and that it was predominantly for oil. So it should probably go without saying that if neither America nor Australia had done the dumb fuck things they did at the turn of the century, there likely would only be a friction of the drama occurring in the Middle East and out of it, right, that there is today. I just thought I would throw that out there, just like the gun control thing, despite it not really being measurable in terms of effect. I mean, let's be real for a sec, right? Israel would probably still be being assholes, but that's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother day, right? My point is that Howard's Iraq decision led to Australia's participation in the war on terror, the never-ending war on an ideology, not a set target or people, that still continues to this day. Within 10 years of that decision, so by about 2012, it had already cost the nation over $31 billion, according to the Sydney Morning Herald. Imagine how high that number is today, another whole decade later. I don't even want to look it up, but I imagine it's probably almost double. Now, I know I'm going off on a tangent here, right? But imagine what else we could have done with that money. A huge fuck-off tunnel under the Blue Mountains connecting the central western New South Wales cities like Orange and Bathurst with the Sydney CBD would only cost about $2.8 billion. And it would be the longest tunnel in the history of the world ever built. Not only increasing rural tourism from the cities and giving the economy a local boom in both areas at that point, right? But also increasing international tourism to see the wonder of engineering that it could/would be. And this isn't pie in the sky stuff, right? Like Elon Musk offered as late as 2018 to come plan a course of action for a tunnel that long for the Western Sydney Airport with his boring company, but it was deemed prohibitively expensive by the state of New South Wales. I'll get to more solid and ironclad stuff in a second, I promise, but imagine if we had the $50 or so billion we spent on blowing up Middle Eastern kids and we used it in this manner instead. It doesn't even have to be the failed Bathurst Tunnel. What about WestConnex, for example? If you live in Sydney, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, WestConnex is a failed infrastructure project in Sydney. Just imagine how fast New South Wales state government could have got that project done if they had a spare chunk of federal funding for infrastructure, right? Instead of having to rely on private companies who say they have capital but then don't. Food for thought. Let's go wider afield with Johnny, though, and steer away from the hypothetical ways we could have spent the money that he lost us through war. And let's direct ourselves towards the money we could have earned in other ways entirely that he messed up in other ways entirely. On housing affordability, Howard introduced a capital gains tax concession, bolstered the first home buyers grant, and boosted Chinese immigration, all putting extreme pressure on housing demand. Investor interest and entry into the housing market took off from the moment the capital gains tax concession began, and just in case you don't know what that entails, I'll try to explain it as simply as I can here, right? If you sell a capital asset, such as shares or in most nations, real estate, you either have to make a capital gain or a capital loss. It's extremely uncommon for you to sell capital for the exact same price you bought it, right? Like, it has generally either become better or worse as a result of you buying it or over the course of you owning it. A good set of examples for those that live locally to me here in upstate New York would be Terry and Kim Pagula. They bought the Buffalo Bills NFL team in 2014 for $1.4 billion. If they were to sell the team today for $2 billion, their capital gains would be around 0.6 of $1 billion, and in New York State, they'd be taxed 20% of that $0.6 billion because of their total income. The same people bought the Buffalo Sabres in 2011 for $189 million, and if they were to sell that team today, they would probably find themselves with a capital loss of around 10 or 20 million based on the decade the team's had since, right? They wouldn't be taxed on the loss, obviously, but in a nutshell, capital gains or capital losses are the difference between what it costs to acquire the asset and what you receive when you dispose of it, okay? A capital gains tax is a tax on the profit you made from your sale or on your capital gains. Seems fairly self-explanatory at that point, right? You need to report your capital gains and your capital losses in your income tax return and pay tax on your capital gains in basically every country in the Western world, right? Places like Panama and the Cayman Islands being the exception, and now you know why they're so popular amongst big-time rich fucks, right? In terms of offshore accounts and why they do that. But here's the kicker when it comes to Australia, right? The capital gains tax concession was a John Howard-led initiative by his government, which made it so that most of your property wouldn't count towards your taxes. Only 25% of your capital gains accrued by property would be taxed by the government, and it would be taxed at your income tax rate, not a set standard, right? So, be it a family home or an investment property or a second investment property or a third investment property or an entire fucking condominium of investment properties that you hastily built on suboptimal, subdivided land with subcontractors doing sub-quality work without a care in the world because you knew you'd be reselling within the year and it didn't matter what the problem was because there was no fucking accountability at any stage in the process. Whatever the case may be, right? You wouldn't have to pay capital gains tax on the entirety of that profit. And if you had a good enough accountant, you wouldn't have to pay any at all. Howard and his cronies spun this as being for the families at the time, but families now wallow helplessly in the backwash of his deliberately idiotic decisions. The housing market in Australia, and in the capital cities like Sydney and Perth especially, instantly boomed with foreign investment to the point where, as I write this script, 14.9% of all land in Australia is owned by foreign nationals. That number might seem low to you if you're not interested in property, 14.9%, but for comparison, that same number in America is only 2.7%, and in the UK is 1.3%. Not to mention, in 1990, the average house in Sydney cost roughly $155,000. Factoring in inflation, that's about 310 grand today, or 310,000 in today's money, right? According to Google. After the introduction of the capital gains tax concession by Howard, tracking all the way to now, the average house price in Sydney is over $1 million. And that's the average. That's the average price. Imagine the super nice ritzy houses near the shoreline, right? Howard pushed the agenda back then that the capital gains tax concession would help families, but in reality, it was a huge tax break for his billionaire and millionaire buddies who worked in real estate development. And it entirely priced working families out of the housing market in every major city of the country. Incidentally, right, if you're an Australian worried about the ticky-tacky, like plasticky sort of square block apartments going up around all of the outskirts of every suburban city with a rail line that heads to a major town, right? You should be aware that these things have come about directly as a result of Howard's capital gains tax concession. Kevin Rudd floated the idea of getting rid of it in 2008. He was knifed by Julia Gillard a few months later. Julia Gillard eventually came to the party and spoke about the potential requirement for capital gains change in 2011. And she lost the election to Tony fucking Abbott as a result, right? Tony Abbott is what I imagine the skin that develops on off milk would look like if it could take a human form, by the way. Incidentally, the Labor Party has taken removing the capital gains tax concession to every major election since 2013 and has lost every single one. And it's precisely because of the successful propagandizing done by John Howard that it was for the families in the beginning that occurs, I reckon. Like sure, right? That mum and dad with 2 kids and a dog, they might avoid paying some tax when they move houses the 1 or 2 times, hypothetically, that they do so in their lifetimes after purchasing a house, right? But that's a side effect of the legislation, not the intent. And that becomes obvious as soon as you look at a list of donors to the Liberal and National parties. Those are developers. But anyway, let's talk numbers, right? Research by the Australia Institute has shown that within 7 years of being implemented, those tax cuts for the rich equated to $169 billion of foregone revenue. 42% of that money, $71 billion, went to the top 10% of Australian income earners. The top 10% got more in tax cuts than all of the bottom 80% combined. But hey, it was for the mum and pops, right? So that's 2 issues, okay? The wars in the Middle East and the capital gains tax concessions, and we've already lost a potential of $200 billion by 2011 as a result of Howard's ineptitude. By the by, it costs NASA and the European Space Agency a combined $3 billion per year between them to run the International Space Station. Australia could have paid to put our very own up there and shunt it into orbits for roughly 100 years with the money that Howard's lost us in the making of those 2 decisions. 2 decisions, no space agency. Not that we would have, I'm just saying, right? It's simultaneously fun and sad to contemplate where that money could or would have gone. But let's keep going, shall we? Because as hard as it may be to believe, Johnny actually gets much, much worse. In regards to education, Howard dramatically increased federal funding to private schools, which they largely spent on non-educational luxuries like swimming pools and tennis courts and amenities for the religious staff on site at the school as opposed to the students. And he absolutely starved public schools in the process of doing that. The results of which, the result is the worsening scores Australia gets on a national scale and an international scale as well. On international testing, we're steadily worsening and worsening with no end in sight since he took over. And then the subsequent prime ministers have not made the changes they need to, right? Both Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard attempted to fix the education debacle with the Gonski Review of Education. Someone remind me in the comments, Gonski, Gonski. It deserves and will get its own whole video at some point, but sadly, both Rudd and Gillard, and eventually Turnbull as well, were forced to concede and eventually disregard most of the findings from that review entirely. In fact, Gillard was in such a precarious position in our hung parliament that she had to concede that among any Labor-led education reform, no school would be worse off than they were under the current budget. Which is just like mind-bendingly stupid. Never mind the fact that schools like Sydney Boys, which is a so-called prestigious school that charges students $30,000 per term, that's $120K per year to attend. Never mind that Sydney Boys were getting more and more funding than the public schools like Aird's High School, which was planted directly in the middle of a public housing estate, like the projects for my American viewers, and had some of the most difficult students in the state, right? And by difficult students, I mean students who spoke English as a second language, right? Or students who came from broken families, or students who were mentally ill, and students who were the victims of considerable and complex trauma in their childhood, right? Like the kids themselves are not difficult. They're the end result of difficult circumstances, and they required more focused or more specialised education, okay? So under Gillard's promise, Sydney Boys needed to keep getting the exact same funding from the government, and the money for Aird's High would just have to come from thin air, apparently, not the already allocated funds for education in the budget, right? Thanks, John. Thanks, Jules. You're both fucking idiots, and you're from opposite side of politics. What a surprise. Howard tried 4 separate times to flatly repeal Medicare. Medicare is Australia's system of universal healthcare for all, right? It's when it became apparent he would be voted out of office for doing so, John Howard went the backdoor route then and removed swathes of surgeries from what was coverable under the Medicare scheme. If you've ever been told by your doctor that an operation you desperately needed to stop the pain was classified as an elective surgery for Medicare purposes, you have John Winston Howard to thank for your waiting period, right? If you've ever stayed in hospital longer than 60 days and had to have a discussion about a copay from the 61st day and onwards, you can thank Johnny Winston Howard for that one too. Want your hip replaced because you've been walking on this arthritic thing for half a decade or 20 years or whatever it is. You want your hip replaced because it's causing you to limp in addition to a great deal of pain, right? Boom. That's elective surgery, not covered by Medicare. That last one wasn't John Howard though, by the by. It was Prime Minister Scott Morrison, and the change was made recently in May of 2021. Please, Australia, pay attention to how much of a cunt that man is as well, and vote him out at your next election. Please. He's coming for the rest of Medicare too, and he won't make it obvious. And just saying, the vast majority of you don't pay enough attention to see it even when he does make it obvious. So just do what you're told and vote him out, please. But anyway, back to Howard. These days, people can often be heard bemoaning the casualisation of the workforce, right? The underemployment of today's youth and low wage growth. The vast majority of the factors that lead to those issues in Australia can be whittled down to Howard's industrial relations policies coming to fruition, culminating in work choices near the end of his torturous reign as our country's leader. In May of 2005, Prime Minister John Howard informed the Australian House of Representatives that the federal government intended to reform Australian industrial relations law. He planned to do that by introducing a unified national system. Work choices was the name given to the changes made to the federal industrial relations laws the Liberal National Party proposed at the time. Work choices was supposedly designed to improve employment levels and national economic performance. I'm not sure if I've acknowledged this yet, but just in case it isn't obvious, right? John Howard was an incredibly politically astute individual. I disagreed with just about everything he ever did, vehemently in most cases, but it cannot be said that I think he was poor in his ability to politique. He had an uncanny ability to present something as beneficial to the Australian public when, with hindsight, it was only ever going to be beneficial to his buddies at any point in the process. He was the master of misdirection and a propaganda prophet, but even he couldn't spin work choices as something that would benefit the broader public. Work choices got rid of unfair dismissal laws for companies under a certain size. No shit, if you were a small to medium-sized company, you could hire and fire based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, whatever the heck you wanted for a small while there in Australia in the early 2000s. I remember a close friend of my mother's was fired the day before she was supposed to start her maternity leave because they could. That was what they said to her, right? Just because they can now. And because it saved the company money across that 6-month period. And it was perfectly legal. Encouraged even. Precisely because of work choices. Work choices also made adjustments to a workforce's ability to legally go on strike, restricted workers' abilities to bargain for conditions with collectivised representation, and significantly restricted trade union activity to the point of near criminalising them. And I'll say this, I will say this unequivocally, in fact. If you advocate for the busting of unions, I advocate for the busting of your skull. The same can be said for corrupt union officials, of course. You can't have it either side. You're both absolutely scum. But anyway, moving on, right? Work choices was one of the issues Kevin Rudd campaigned on in 2007 to finally beat Howard, and it was widely regarded as the reason he won. He overturned the policy within 30 days of being elected as Australia's 26th Prime Minister. But we're not done with Howard yet. I'm just riffing with rage, right, as I write this, and work choices was the thing I wanted to mention next, but look how long the video has to go, okay? Look at the little red bar down there. We're nowhere near close to done yet. Howard politicised the public service in Australia when he sacked 6 department heads upon coming into power in 1996. In a public display of him wielding his power just after being elected, in the one motion, the one evening, known in political historian circles as the Night of the Long Knives in Australia, Howard sacked the head secretary of Immigration, Transport, Foreign Affairs, Health, Environment and Employment, and Education and Training. This is a trend that Tony Milkskin Abbott would follow to show his so-called political strength by sacking 3 department heads head secretaries, upon his election in 2013. And it is what Scott Morrison would try to do, or what he would do, to try to show his strength and link himself to the 2 men mentioned previously in 2018, when he fired 2 head secretaries in one night himself. It isn't as quantifiable or measurable as the over $300 billion lost from the initial 2 factors that Johnny messed up that I've discussed already, but the job security of the head secretary of departments of health, transport, or education and training, right, being at the whim of whatever is politically expedient, is not a fast way to get things done. The whole point of non-elected officials in those capacities is to keep the train on the track when each government gets derailed. And it was Johnny who started the process of derailment hands-free, but let's move on, right? When it came to Indigenous affairs, Howard's legacy was that of the worst Prime Minister since the Stolen Generations. His abolition of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was abhorrent. ATSIC was basically a voice for Indigenous issues in Parliament, by the way. People campaigning for an entirely new government body for Indigenous issues need only open a history book before protesting. We could remove Howard's legislation and fund the Commission properly and adequately at the stroke of a pen if the government wanted. He only removed it in 2004. I was in high school in 2004. It's not a fall-on relic of yesteryear. We could revive it with ease if those in power had the inclination. And sticking with Indigenous affairs for a second, Howard was the architect of the failed intervention in the Northern Territory, which in short can be summed up as an attempt to reinstate the policy of the Stolen Generations, wherein white government officials enter Aboriginal reservations, kidnap the children, and put them in foster homes to be raised more appropriately. This began in 2007 and was a Howard policy that Rudd continued, to his great shame. The outlined and quoted purpose of the intervention was directed at addressing the disproportionate levels of violence in Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory, as well as the systemic disadvantage of Indigenous people, characterised by economic deprivation, unemployment, social marginalisation, inadequate housing, and poor health and justice outcomes. In reality, the so-called intervention was a $587 million package of legislation that made a number of changes affecting specified Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory. It included restrictions on alcohol, changes to welfare payments, literal land acquisition from people they deemed unable to tend to it, right? That's some backwards 1700s colonial shit, right? Restrictions on education, employment and health initiatives, and restrictions on pornography, amongst other measures. At the 2007 federal election, Australian rock god Peter Garrett, who had long since campaigned for Aboriginal reconciliation with his band Midnight Oil, won a seat in Kevin Rudd's Labor Party. He was bent over and royally rogered by the do-nothing career politicians like Bill Shorten in the Labor Party within a few short years, but at the start there, he was seen as a potential threat and a potential big-name player in Australian politics. You've probably heard of him or his art, even if you're American, actually. This song, that dance, like that bald dude, that's Peter Garrett. But yeah, the point of bringing up Garrett was this. In 2008, at the behest of Peter and his bandmates, Kevin Rudd publicly apologised in Parliament to the stolen generations of Aboriginal children in Australia. At the very time he was uttering his apology to placate Garrett and the other white leftists in his party, the Northern Territory intervention was still a policy in place, and his agents were still removing Aboriginal children from their families. I don't know about you guys, but where I'm from, sorry means you won't do it again. But I guess I digress. Howard's failure to say sorry to the stolen generations of Aboriginal people during his reign in the 90s and early 2000s was considered one of his more negative aspects by the populace as a whole. But at the end of the day, I think Rudd's apology was empty anyway. Fuck it. I'll digress a bit further because it actually means a lot to me, right? In case you can't tell. Sorry means you regret the action you're apologising for. Sorry means you want to mend a relationship that you know you've caused harm to. Sorry means you won't keep doing the thing you're apologising for all the way up until 2019, you colossal pieces of fucking shit. Don't apologise until you're ready to change your behaviour. Don't apologise if you're not actually sorry. Don't apologise just to end a national conversation, especially when you're not fucking sorry. But anyway, back to Howard. I did a whole video on the Children Overboard scandal, right? I'll link to it at the end of this one if you haven't seen it yet. It's in my history playlist. The core TLDR of that story is that John Howard proudly lied to the public about asylum seekers, and his xenophobic rhetoric has lasted the test of time in Australia. Howard joined the Liberal Party when it was what he called a broad church. Then when he was in power, he systematically removed everything left of the nave and turned it into a conservative party in which a rich, white hedge fund manager who happens to occasionally think about the environment has difficulty finding a pew. Yes, Howard implemented gun control, but that was fairly easy in a nation that had just been shocked by the largest gun murder in history to that date. Yes, Australia broke records for continuous economic growth under his stewardship, but again, this was a fairly easy task after the Hawke and Keating reforms and amidst a mining boom that Howard largely squandered. I haven't mentioned that in this video because it's going to get its own. Howard followed the US out of Kyoto Agreement. He reluctantly agreed that a carbon tax would be worthwhile, but then did absolutely sweet fuck all about it. He encouraged the states to privatise electricity and in 1998 set up the national electricity market based on market principles, meaning electricity network owners, suppliers and retailers could legally screw consumers and small businesses, and they've done so ever since, fucking consistently. He introduced the goods and services tax, the GST, making the price of yachts go down and the price of milk go up in one swift motion. In a bit over 10 years, the man did everything he could to make the upper class more successful, and he gave exactly zero fucks about the working class of Australia. I'm sure I forgot some things or missed something that I'll remember during the edit. I mean, there was a long career to cover, and I'm sure I just scratched the surface of his fuckwittery, but these were just some of the reasons I think John Howard is a cunt. He was our worst ever Prime Minister until Tony Abbott came along and tried to emulate a weird fucking mix of Howard crossed with Margaret Thatcher without a single doubt. I would have called him a cunt in the title, but I like money, and advertising on this channel is something I enjoy doing. Speaking of money, these mad dogs give me some of theirs on a monthly basis. Check the links in the description if you'd like to figure out how to do that yourself, or, you know, don't. Just subscribe and watch some more of my videos, please. Every little bit helps, right? Let me know what you thought of the video in the comments below. Ask any questions you have about Johnny Winston Howard, and I'll do my best to answer them and share this video with a friend. Sorry, I'll do my best to answer them. I should have put a full stop there. If you can share this video with a friend, that'd be great, okay? Do me a solid. If you've got through this video all the way to this point, leave me a like. I'll see you when I look at your squad. You'll see me when you look at me. Thanks so much for watching.